Let's take a few minutes to generate as positive a motivation as possible for being here tonight, listening to this talk. So you can remember the motivation you generated early this morning, wanting to benefit all beings, wanting to avoid harming others, wanting to reach enlightenment, awakening, Buddhahood, to be of the best possible benefit to all beings. And then in particular, what we're going to be looking at tonight and the next few weeks is the topic of the mind as explained in Buddhism. And this is a really important topic because Buddhism explains that mind is the source of all experiences. Happiness, suffering, peace, misery, positive states of mind, negative states of mind. So all of these depend primarily on our own mind rather than on external things. And so if we do want happiness and peace, and we want to bring happiness and peace to others, it's really important to have an understanding of the mind, what it is, how it works, what are the different types of mind that exist, which ones are erroneous and lead to problems and suffering and continued existence in samsara, and learn how to decrease and overcome those states of mind. And then learn which types of mind are correct and in accordance with how things are and are the cause of happiness, peace, liberation, and ultimately enlightenment. And then learn how to develop those states of mind and have those in our mind more and more of the time. So this is what we're going to be learning about. And just remember that the reason for doing this isn't just intellectual stimulation, having more knowledge, being smarter than other people, but to benefit ourselves and others as much as possible, to bring about greater peace, happiness, and to decrease suffering and its causes, and ultimately bring all of us to the state of enlightenment, Buddhahood. Venerable had asked me to talk about this topic of the 7 types of awareness. And this topic is included in a topic called Lorik, which is one of the subjects studied in the monasteries, usually in the early stages of monastic education. And it's kind of complicated. It's not easy. When I studied this, it was a long time ago, maybe, early 80s. And I think we spent 3 months, 5 days a week, 2 hours a day, plus discussion, review classes. And even then, we didn't cover everything. I didn't feel like I came out of it with full understanding of everything. And here, I think we have just 4 sessions, although if we don't finish now, we can continue later, perhaps. So we can't expect to cover every aspect of it, but I'll just try to give an overall view, an overall explanation of this topic. And there are a couple of books in English covering this topic, such as this one, Mind in Tibetan Buddhism. Some of you may have attempted to read it. And so I'm going to use this as the basis for my explanation. Another book is called Mind and Its Functions by Geshe Rabten. The teacher was Geshe Rabten. And that's actually probably an easier book to read. It's easier, more kind of clear and simple and down to earth. But one problem is, I don't know, maybe it's not a problem, but it is a problem. There's a lot of technical terms, and different translators will use different English terms to translate these Tibetan terms. So this book is translated by Elizabeth Napper. It's mainly teachings by Lati Rinpoche, and Elizabeth Napper was the translator. And she's a colleague of Jeffrey Hopkins. And Jeffrey Hopkins and his colleagues tend to use pretty much the same terminology, including like the book you've been studying by Daniel Perdue. I think they use pretty much the same English terms for things, which makes it simpler. But then when you read Geshe Rabten's book, the translator was using different terminology. So, yeah, sometimes you come across something and it's like, what is that? What is he talking about? It's actually something quite simple, but because he's using different terms, it gets complicated. So I'm just going to pretty much stick to this book, and we don't have time to go through all of this. There's a lot of details in this, and so I made this this handout. It's only the first part now. Did everyone get a copy of it? So we'll go through this. This is just kind of taking the main points of this, and we'll leave time for questions as well as we go along. So before getting into the 7 types of awareness, I'd just like to talk about some more basic aspects of the mind itself, which will help us once we do get into the 7 types of awareness. So the first thing on this handout is a definition of awareness. What are we talking about? And the term for awareness here is actually lo, as in losang. Lo sometimes is translated as awareness, sometimes it's translated as mind, but I'll just use this term because that's what Elizabeth Napper uses here. So lo, or awareness, is translated as, defined as mere clarity and knowing. And we're going to go through these terms one by one. Because sometimes when teachers are teaching this topic, they just say, the definition of mind is clear and knowing. And then they go on to the next point. What is that? What does that mean, clear and knowing? So I thought to spend a little bit of time just looking at what these terms mean. And some of this information I got from, there's a book called the Geluk Kagyu Tradition of Mahamudra. I don't know if you've seen that, quite a big, thick book. Its teaching is given by the Dalai Lama on Mahamudra. But the first part of the book is written by Alex Berzin, kind of introduction to the whole topic of mind. Because Mahamudra basically is looking at emptiness, understanding emptiness, in particular the emptiness of the mind, using the mind as the basis for understanding emptiness. So that means you have to understand the mind before you can understand the emptiness of the mind. It's right up at the top here. If you look under the title, it says 7 types of awareness, and then under that, sources, blah, blah, blah. So the very last source is Chapter 4 of the Geluk Kagyu Tradition of Mahamudra. It's in the library under the Dalai Lama's books. So anyway, in that in the book, chapter 4, Alex Berzin gives a really nice explanation of the mind, going through these terms one by one. So I'm going to take some of that material here. Okay, so the definition of mind then, the first term is, well, it says mere, but I put mere in parentheses because it's not always included. In some definitions, mere is left out, but Alex includes it and he explains, and it has a kind of juicy meaning. But I'll start with clarity or clear, sel in Tibetan. So, what is clarity? What is clear? There's different ways of explaining it to make it even more complicated. So, one meaning, this is from Geshe Rabten's book actually, Mind and Its Functions, is clarity refers to the non-material, space-like nature of consciousness. Consciousness is another term for mind. We'll get to that later. There's synonyms of mind. I.e., it's being completely devoid of color, shape, form, or material dimension. Okay, so that's one way we can explain clear. Clear simply means it's not physical, it's not material. So it has no physical properties like shape, color, size, weight, dimension. It's invisible. We can't see it with our eyes. Intangible. We can't feel it with our fingers or put it under a microscope. So it doesn't have any physical qualities. And it's space-like. I don't think it means literally like space, but space-like in the sense that there's really nothing solid there, nothing obstructive. So for me, that kind of makes sense. It just means it's not physical. But another meaning of clear, this is from Alex Berzin. He says that word in Tibetan has the sense of giving rise to. The mind always gives rise to something, meaning its object, and is clear about it, i.e. makes it clear. So that's a little harder to understand for me anyway. What does that mean? But anyway, I'm sharing it with you. We can think about it, try to understand it. But one thing they do say, bullet point number 3, is the mind is like a mirror in that it takes on an aspect or reflection of its object. I always found that really mystifying, trying to understand what it means that mind is like a mirror. But if you think about a mirror, like for example, let's say this is a mirror, and if you put an object in front of a mirror, like a Buddha statue, you put a Buddha statue here in front of the mirror, then there'll be a reflection of the Buddha statue in the mirror. So the object casts a reflection into the mirror. The mirror takes on a reflection of that object. And this just happens kind of naturally, automatically. So it's said that the mind is similar, somewhat similar to that, in that when, let's say we look at a Buddha statue, we look at this Buddha statue, the Buddha statue casts an image to our mind, and our mind arises in an aspect of the Buddha image. And that's how our mind knows the object. That's how our mind sees the object, by appearing in an aspect similar to the way a mirror takes on an aspect of an object. Does that make sense? Anyway, that's what they say. That's how they explain it, the way that the mind works. But there are differences between the mind and a mirror. One difference, of course, is a mirror doesn't have awareness. It doesn't know, doesn't experience the object. It just, takes on an image of the object, but there's no awareness there. Okay? So whereas on the other hand, our mind, when it takes on an aspect or an image or reflection of the object, it simultaneously knows it, which is the meaning of the next term in the definition, knowing, knower. And another difference between the mirror and the mind is a mirror is just kind of sitting there all the time, like on the wall, or usually we have mirrors on the wall. So it's just sitting there waiting for objects to come along and, faces to come in front of them, and then it will reflect them. But the mind isn't like that. The mind isn't something that's just sitting inside of us waiting for objects to throw themselves at us and cast themselves to us. It doesn't work like that. And I'll leave that till we get to the third term of mir to understand what that means. But let's first look at the next term, which is knowing, in Tibetan rikpa. Knowing or knower. Sometimes rikpa is also translated as cognition. Some translators use that term, cognition, but again, I'm just sticking with Elizabeth's translation. So what this means is mind always has an object. It's never the case that mind will exist just by itself without an object, without something that is known. Okay? There's always this kind of duality in the sense of there's always an object and a mind, a subject and an object. Okay? Can never exist just by itself without an object. And what the mind does, this is like the function of the mind, what it does, it knows its object, it experiences its object, it is aware of its object, it engages with its object. These are actually different terms in the Tibetan to describe what the mind does with its object, how the mind relates to its object. Okay, it knows. I think that's not so difficult to understand because this is happening with us all the time, constantly, non-stop, 24 hours a day. We have minds knowing objects. And I'm saying here minds because it's a little bit deceptive to just say mind in the singular as if it's one thing. It's not just one thing. It's multiple. It's infinite. Each moment, there's a moment of mind, an instance of mind knowing an object. And the next moment, another instance of mind knowing an object, mind knowing an object. So there's actually countless minds continuing in a stream, one moment after another. Different minds knowing their objects, as opposed to one single mind sitting inside of us knowing objects. Does that make sense? So it's better to think of it in the plural rather than the singular. And the third bullet point says, but that does not mean it is always fully conscious, nor that it understands its object. Okay? So, there are times when we have minds knowing objects or experiencing objects, but there's no understanding what this object is. That happens to us all the time. We see something we've never seen before and have no idea what it is. So we're seeing it, we're experiencing it, or hearing a sound or whatever. And there's awareness, there's consciousness, there's experiencing of that object, but not really comprehension, understanding it. Okay? So it's not necessary for mind to always understand its object. And it's also not necessary for mind to be fully aware or conscious, because it said that even when we're asleep, when we're asleep, we can have different experiences. Sometimes there's dreams, and again, that's mind having these experiences that are totally just created by the mind, no external existence at all, just coming from the mind making these movies. The other night I was having my own personal sci-fi movie going on. I don't remember. It totally disappeared as soon as I woke up, but I just knew it was like a sci-fi movie. So it's just totally created by the mind. And so that's happening when we're asleep. But there's also times when there's dreamless sleep. There's no dreams at all. Just like deep, dark unconsciousness. Or this could also happen when somebody's in a coma, unconscious. Okay? So there's not even dreams there. But according to Buddhism, Even though in English we say the person is unconscious, but from the Buddhist point of view, consciousness is still there. There is still consciousness happening. There's still mind happening. There's still awareness happening of something. That person's mind is still there experiencing something, even if it's just darkness, even if it's just blackness or blankness. Mind is still there experiencing something. Okay, but we would say he's out of it. He's unconscious. But there is consciousness there. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's why it says here that mind doesn't always have to understand its object. It doesn't always have to be fully aware or conscious of its object, but it's always there experiencing something. So that's the meaning of that term know or knowing. And then the third term, which is sometimes there, sometimes not, mere. So this again is from Alex, and he says, mind is merely a cognitive event, giving rise to an object and experiencing it. Okay, so there's just an individual mind, because again, mind is plural rather than singular. But if we focus on one single moment of mind, it's a cognitive event. It arises because of various causes and conditions. It has an object that it's aware of, that it's experiencing, and then it disappears. Right away. Minds only last a fraction of a moment, and then they disappear like bubbles. I like to think of bubbles. Bubbles arise and immediately disappear. Or flashes of lightning in the sky, when there's a thunderstorm and there's these flashes. They just flash and then they're gone. And it's not that they've gone somewhere else. They just went out of existence. So I think of that as an analogy for the mind. It's just a flash, experiencing an object and then immediately gone. But it's immediately followed by the next one. Okay? So there's just this continuous stream. There's no break. There's never a break, never a time when there's no mind experiencing something. But it's this stream made up of these individual experiences. So that's one meaning of mere. Also, mere can exclude the need for attentiveness, understanding, evaluation, and so on. Okay, so again, there isn't always the need for us to be fully attentive to what we're experiencing, or understand what we are experiencing, or evaluate what we are experiencing. So often our mind is aware of objects, but not fully attentive and understanding and so forth. So just mere experiencing of objects. And then another meaning of mere, I like this one. The third point, it says it also excludes, one, the mind being like a machine that sees, thinks, and so forth. Because I think sometimes people might have that idea that sitting inside of us somewhere is this thing we call the mind, and it's sitting there all the time, and it's just having this function of experiencing things, like one solid thing. Maybe we get this idea because of the idea of the brain. We think of in Western science, that's how the function of the brain inside of our head is there all the time, and it's just experiencing things. So we might think of the mind, even though we know from the Buddhist point of view it's not a physical thing, but we still might have the idea that it's something like the brain, non-physical brain sitting inside of us, experiencing things. So it's not like that. Again, it's not just one thing sitting inside of us that's seeing and thinking and hearing and so forth. And also, number 2, it says there's no solid I that uses the mind to see, think, and so forth. So this is getting more into the realm of emptiness. But if you pay attention to your mind, to your experience, you might notice that there's a sense of an I, a separate I, behind the mind. And this is what we say in our language. I see, I think, I feel, I like, I don't like, right? So we have a sense that there's another thing there, which is an I, that is thinking and seeing. And that's also a fabrication. That's also not true. There's only these moments, flashes of experience arising and passing, experiencing objects, but no separate I, self, me, behind them or beneath them or running the show. Experiencing things. Only the mind experiencing things, not an I. That's an extra thing. Okay, so these are different meanings of the term mere. If mere is there in the definition, but even if it's not in the definition, these are still true, true facts about the mind and the experience. Okay. Any questions so far about any of those? Just trying to focus more on what the mind is, what the meaning of the mind is. So?
More of a comment than a question, but it really changes the flavor for me to think of minds, using the plural of each moment being a mind, as opposed to there being this one solid mind that I would identify with my personality or me. It changes the flavor of how the idea of how to conceive of the mind. If it's each moment is a mind in itself, or I don't know. I'm working with that.
Also, they often use the term continuum instead of mind. They use GU. Mental continuum, and that helps too, because that means it's a series, a continuing series of individual moments. Which, if I don't know, I'm not a Tibetan scholar, but perhaps if you grow up with that word, that term, that way of thinking of the mind, mental continuum, mental stream, that might also help to avoid this sense of mind being one single thing sitting inside of us.
How long does the moment of mind last? I seem to remember hearing that it arises and dissolves simultaneously. Is that true?
Well, just the first part about the length. Sometimes in the Tibetan tradition, they talk about like a finger snap divided into 65 parts. So 1/65th of a finger snap. I don't know what that would be, what the equivalent would that be in Western. Because I think in Western science they talk about nanoseconds and milliseconds, and I don't know what's the shortest, if they even have such a thing as the shortest. But anyway, sometimes they use that analogy in Tibetan Buddhism and say, so 65 times in the snap of a finger you can have moments of mind. But in the Theravada tradition, they have amazing numbers, like billions, millions, billions in a moment. So they have the rate of change is much faster. But then some people say, well, who's counting? I mean, how can anybody? I mean, a Buddha or an Arhat would be fully aware of every single experience that's happening. So they would be able to count or, keep track of how many there are each moment. But there's different numbers. Anyway, the point is there isn't an agreement among all the traditions about how many, but it's pretty fast. And what was the other part you asked? Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, this is most Buddhist traditions other than the Vaibhashikas. The Vaibhashikas say there's a moment of arising and then abiding and then ceasing. These are like 3 different moments. But the other traditions say, no, it all happens at once. Arising, abiding, and ceasing happens not really, I don't know if you could say simultaneously, but they all happen in one moment. That's not something I can fully understand, but anyway, it's really instant. Huh? less than a finger snap. Yeah, it's explained in Meditation on Emptiness. Next week I can bring that in. I couldn't explain it myself, but there is an explanation in there about how those three things, abiding, arising, and ceasing, actually, I think, if I remember correctly, they do happen simultaneously. They're like different aspects of one moment, one whatever tiniest fraction of a period of time.
Like a flow rather than like a bunch of little frames.
Yeah, the thing is, I understand it. So, what if we could slow it down and look at each single mind that's arising? So, a mind arises, has its object, immediately ceases, but when we say cease, it doesn't like totally go out of existence, but it turns into the next one. One moment of mind is the cause for the next moment of mind, and then that one is the cause for the next moment of mind, and that one is the cause for the next moment, and so on. So it is, as I understand it, this is my understanding, I could be wrong, it is continuous, and there's no breaks or gaps. I mean, it must be amazing if you develop your mind to the point where you can see every single instant of mind. Make you dizzy. Yeah, I think even Aryas, they say Aryas are aware of that. Every single experience that's happening. Whew. Mind-blowing. Okay, so then there's this, the last part of that section. This is from Alex Berzin's explanation. He says, mind in Buddhism refers to experience, namely the mere arising and cognitive engaging with the contents of experience. The continuity of experience is known as the mind stream or mental continuum. It is always individual. An individual here can have the sense of each person having their own mind. Some people have this idea that there's this big cosmic consciousness, universal consciousness that we are all part of. I think in Hinduism there is some idea like that, and some people mix that up with Buddhism, but according to Buddhism that's not the case. Each person, each individual being, sentient being, has their own individual mental continuum, and our mental continuums don't kind of get mixed up or merge with each other, all the way up to Buddhahood. So each one of us has our own individual mind, with each moment of experience following from previous moments of experience, according to the karmic laws of behavioral cause and effect. Or, we could say dependent arising. There's many different factors, causes, and conditions that affect our mind and give rise to whatever it is that we experience. Big part of it, of course, is karma, but other things as well. We can be affected by the weather, by how our body is, if our body is sick or healthy. So things happening around us. So many, many different things can affect us to, give rise to experiences in our mind. Let's just take a few minutes to reflect on this before we go on to the next point. So I'd like you to close your eyes. And I'm going to ring the gong and just focus on the sound of the gong, the experience of hearing this sound. So just focus on that. So there are two things going on. There's the sound itself, the object, and then there's a mind hearing it. So see if you can be aware of those two things. And what's actually happening is the sound of the gong casts an image or a reflection to the mind, and then the mind, in this case it would be hearing consciousness, arises in an aspect of the sound, similar to a reflection in a mirror. And when the mind arises in the aspect of the sound, it simultaneously knows it or experiences it. And that's actually how the mind knows or experiences objects. So this is happening with us continuously. There are objects, visual objects, sounds, smells, tastes, bodily sensations, and also mental objects, casting an aspect or reflection of themselves to the mind taking on an aspect of the object, and that's how the mind knows objects, by arising in an aspect or reflection of the object. This is happening continuously, moment after moment, many times each moment. Different minds arising, experiencing their objects, and then ceasing, giving rise to the next moment of mind. And it's all happening without any I, self, me, who's behind these experiences, experiencing them, or manipulating them, making them happen. It just all happens kind of automatically due to causes and conditions, dependent arising. Okay, so you can open your eyes. Have visual minds happening now. Okay, so the next section, letter B, is synonyms. So there are three terms here that are all synonymous, or what is it called? Mutually inclusive. Okay, so you're learning that in the debate class. So the first one is awareness or mind. I'm putting the Tibetan here. You know, you can ignore it if you want, but if you are looking at different books by different authors, translators, and so on, like I say, they do sometimes translate a Tibetan word with a different English word. So if you do know the Tibetan term, then usually the book has a glossary at the back. You can look it up and say, oh, okay, so that's what they're talking about. In this other book, it's called something else. So it just helps to make things less confusing. So one term in Tibetan then is lo. The B is silent, so it's lo. And that here is translated as awareness or mind. And the second term, which Elizabeth translates as consciousness, Jeffrey as well, I think, all that group, all that gang, they use consciousness. That's shepa in Tibetan. And the third term is knower or cognizer, rikpa, which is also, sometimes translated as knower, cognizer. So those three terms, in Tibetan, lo, shepa, and rikpa, those three terms are synonymous. They all have the same meaning. So these are the most general terms for mind. And then when you get into details with Lorik, they divide the mind up into different groups, different categories. But whatever divisions of mind there are, they all have these same qualities of clear and knowing. So it's like if we take human beings, all the human beings in the world, okay, so there's certain criteria that makes somebody a human being. Okay. And so if you fit into the group of human beings, okay, then that's like one category. And then among human beings, we can divide them in different ways. We can divide them according to gender. Okay, so we make groups of human beings according to gender. Or we can divide them according to nationality, or according to race, or according to language, or according to religion, or according to age, or according, and so on. Okay, so you can divide human beings in different ways. And you may say, well, why would we want to do that? Well, it helps you to have a better understanding of all the different possibilities, all the varieties, the diversity of human beings. So you get a better understanding of human beings. So in a similar way, in the subject of Lorik, minds, again, a plural, minds are plural, not just one thing. There's a huge variety of different kinds of minds. And all of those minds have the same qualities that we just looked at. They all fit the definition, clear and knowing, mere, clear and knowing. And then we can divide them up in different ways. And the reason for doing that is just to have a better understanding of the different possibilities, different kinds of minds. So one of the divisions of mind is letter C. And I think this is something you already learned in the debate book. Sense consciousnesses and mental consciousnesses. Okay? So this is one way of dividing minds. And this division is exhaustive, meaning whatever mind there is one of these two. It's either a sense consciousness or a mental consciousness. Nothing can be both, and nothing can be neither. So this is a complete, what's the term for that? Dichotomy? No, not a dichotomy. Well, in terms of minds, it's a dichotomy, yeah. Any mind has to be one of these two. Yeah?
Does the term Sam figure in this?
Yeah, Sam, actually, in Elizabeth's book, she translates Sam as mind. So, Sam, the Sanskrit term is chitta. On page 15 of this book, actually, in her book, this book is quite complicated if you do the whole thing, but the first part of the book is her own introduction to the topic before getting into Lati Rinpoche's commentary. And so in her introduction, it's quite simple and clear, and she goes through these different divisions of mind and explains them in a relatively simple way. So that's something you might want to read if you want to understand better this topic. So on page 15, she says, any mind, in parentheses, chitta or sem, meaning that's the term sem is what she's translating as mind. And I think, well, there's another way of categorizing or dividing mind into minds, primary minds, main minds, and mental factors. We'll get to that later if we have time. But that's a division of mind or consciousness into primary minds and mental factors. And it looks like here that sem means primary mind. Okay, so it's a division of mind rather than an overall term for mind.
So it's not synonymous?
No, it's not synonymous with these. Yeah, there's so many words for mind. And I have the idea, I'm not a scholar, but I think maybe at the time of the Buddha, some of the other Indian philosophers were already using a lot of these terms for mind. And the Buddha would just, pick them up and use them as well. Because I'm wondering, why do they have to have so many different terms for the same thing? But it could be that, they were already in use at the time of the Buddha, and then he used them, and then they were translated into Tibetan?
That's another small aspect. I translated mind into German, English into German, and it's just 15 different translation possibilities.
15 different German
Aspects
words.
of mind that have slightly different meanings, perspectives of mind.
Yeah. I think that's one reason this topic is so complicated. There's just so many different terms. Huh?
There's a lot of words in English too. Awareness, consciousness.
Yeah. I've heard in some languages it's more difficult. They don't have as many different terms. So then it's really challenging to try to find, terminology to cover all the Tibetan words. I think of it maybe like they say the Eskimos have 20 different words for snow. I don't know if that's true or not, but yeah, because there are different kinds of snow. It's not all the same. There's slushy snow and there's frozen snow and this kind of thing. So I think in a similar way, because the Buddhists are so concerned about the mind and understanding the mind and working with the mind, that they're able to recognize there are different kinds of mind. It's not all the same. So you do need different terms for it. Heart. Well, you're not talking about the physical heart. Yeah.
Does this term cover the heart?
No. No, I mean in Tibetan the word for heart is nyingje, or ning, or tuk, the honorific. So it is a different term. Yeah, I wouldn't know how they... But we do sometimes use heart and mind interchangeably. From my heart, I feel this way. But and also, I mean, Tibetans, when they're pointing to the, they're saying I. They usually point here. They think of this. This is the considered the center of our mind, rather than up here. And I think it's because of the system of chakras and channels and so on. They say this is the main place. Like when a baby is developing in the womb, this is the first place that the mind goes and everything comes from there. So there is a strong connection between the heart, not the organ heart, but the heart chakra, the heart center, and the mind or consciousness.
I think in one of Jeffrey's classes, he mentioned that Sem often refers to the ordinary mind, and the word for sentient being is Semchen, or mind possessor. But you don't use that term referring to the mind of a Buddha, because he's not a sentient being. He's not under the control of afflictions and karma. So Sem often has the distinction of ordinary mind under the control of afflictions and karma. So it has a bit of that flavor as well.
Also in Dzogchen tradition, they have different way of explaining. I haven't studied Dzogchen, but the little bit that I've learned, they use the word sem for ordinary mind, like diluted mind, just ordinary, everyday, confused mind. And then they use the word rikpa, which here is translated as knowing. It seems like it's actually the clear light mind. So the goal of that practice is to get in touch with the rikpa, meaning the clear light mind, and get away from the sem, the ordinary mind. So I think, they use the same terms there, but they seem to have a different meaning to them. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at this division, and you probably are familiar with this from the debate book. So could someone explain what's the difference between a sense consciousness and a mental consciousness? How are those differentiated?
According to the empowering condition.
Mm-hmm. Uncommon empowering condition. Yeah. So what is... Could you say more about that?
So there's a sense power, or there's a power, like how to describe that? I forgot the exact definitions, but at least for the senses, sense consciousnesses, it's a material, has a material aspect to it. For the mental consciousness, it's either the power is either material or a consciousness, or it's just a consciousness.
Well, if you scroll down, there's a chart number 1. This is jumping ahead a little bit, but there are these 3 conditions for a perception. A perception, anyway, we'll get to that. But there's 3 different conditions giving rise to a mental state, especially in the case of a perception, like seeing. And the first of these is called the uncommon empowering condition. And for a sense consciousness meaning eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. So there's 5 sense consciousnesses. So the uncommon empowering condition is a sense power, eye sense power, ear sense power, and so on. And the sense power, it's a little complicated, but they say that we have the physical organ, like the eyes, the physical eyeballs, and within that, there's a subtle kind of matter, which is not visible. Like if you dissected the eyeball, you wouldn't be able to see it. It's invisible. It's a very subtle form. That's the actual sense power. Okay, so within the eye, there's the eye sense power. Within the ear, there's the ear sense power, and so on. Nose, tongue, and the body sense power is said to pervade the whole body. It's a kind of form, it's a kind of matter, physical matter, but very subtle, not normally visible. Okay, so sense consciousnesses, all the 5 sense consciousnesses, are dependent on a physical sense power that's, material. And then a mental consciousness is said to have a mental sense power, but the mental sense power is not physical. It's not at all a physical thing. Instead, it's the previous moment of consciousness. So whatever moment of mind was there just before that mental consciousness, that is said to be the mental sense power. So for example, you might be looking at something and then start thinking about it. Okay, so that switch from looking at and thinking about the object, the visual consciousness that's looking at the object will become the mental sense power for the mind that's thinking about it, because thinking is mental consciousness. So that's the difference. The difference between a sense consciousness and a mental consciousness is in terms of what kind of sense power are they arising from, whether it's a physical sense power or a mental sense power. Does that make sense?
I had an understanding that for the mental consciousness there wasn't an observed object condition, whereas in the sense consciousnesses there is an observed object condition.
You're smart. That's explained there. That is true only for conceptions, but not for mental perceptions. So let's look ahead. Let's look at the next topic, which is perceptions and conceptions. Okay, so this is another way of dividing minds that might answer some of these questions. Okay, so these are again 2 different kinds of minds that experience things in somewhat different ways. So perception literally means non-conceptual mind. Okay, this is a mind, a consciousness that is not conceptual, but to understand that we have to look at conception first. And so a perception engages with its object directly rather than through the medium of a mental image, as is the case with conception. So when we have conceptions or thoughts, our mind doesn't connect directly with an object. Instead, it's relating via a mental image. There's always a mental image of our object. Like, for example, if you think of your mother, whether she's alive or not, we can all think of our mother, close our eyes and think of our mother. Even with our eyes open, we can think of our mother. So when we're thinking of our mother, that mind of thinking of mother has an image. There's an image of mother there. Okay? So that's the meaning of a mental image. This is happening all the time. We're having thoughts about things, and what it is we are thinking about is just an image, a mental image of the object, rather than the actual object. Well, so in the case of perceptions, like, when we look at this flask, or whatever you call it, thermos, okay, so our visual consciousness, this is a perception, visual consciousness is relating or connecting directly with the object. And if we close our eyes and think of this object, we have a mental image of it. And generally, perception is considered a more, a better, a superior kind of experience, because the object, it appears so much more clearly, right? When we just close our eyes and think of an object, it doesn't appear so clearly with all the details. It's more fuzzy and, yeah. So perceptions are considered superior to conceptions. But that doesn't mean conceptions are bad, because conceptions are very useful, as we'll look at later. But that's the difference. The difference between perceptions and conceptions. Perception is experiencing the object directly, without a mental image in between, whereas conception is dealing with the object via a mental image. I'll get back to your question later, but first let's look more at perceptions. And the object of a perception, according to... So Lorik is explained according to Sautrantika, the Sutra school. Other schools have other ways of explaining some of these points, but usually in the Tibetan monasteries they study it according to Sautrantika, meaning based on Dharmakirti and Dignaga, their explanation of things. So the object of a perception is always an impermanent phenomena. Perceptions are not able to perceive permanent things. We cannot see permanent things with direct perception, only impermanent things. That gets complicated when it comes to emptiness, but we'll deal with that later. Okay, there's 6 types of perceptions related to the 6 senses: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Okay, so a perception can be either a sense consciousness or a mental consciousness. Okay, so most of our perceptions are sensory ones, meaning seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, the 5 senses. There's also mental perception. Mental perception is a little more complicated. It's said that... Okay, let's look at this chart. So this shows the 6 types of perceptions, and what are the 3 conditions that give rise to them. Did you go through this before? It's in the debate book a little bit. Yeah. So these are said to be the 3 conditions needed for a perception. It's basically the sense power, the object, and the previous moment of mind. That's a simple way of saying it. Those 3 things need to come together in order for perception, like seeing, to arise. So first one is eye, so meaning vision. So when we see an object, there's the eye sense power, the subtle matter, the subtle form inside of our eyeball that has to be functioning. I mean, some people are blind or visually impaired, so that means their eye sense power is not working properly and they're not able to see everything or anything. So the eye sense power has to be there and functioning. The second condition is the object condition, which means, in the case of eye consciousness, visual objects, basically colors and shapes. That's what we see. It's colors and shapes. That's what our visual consciousness picks up. And then the third condition is called the immediately preceding condition, and that refers to the previous moment of consciousness. So as I mentioned before, one moment of consciousness arises and ceases, but it transforms into the next one. Okay, so there has to be a previous moment of consciousness that ceases, and then the next moment becomes the visual consciousness. So that's the immediately preceding condition. So it's similar with the other 5 sense consciousness, sense perception, seeing, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. The 6th one, mental perception. So this has 3 conditions as before. The mental sense power. The mental sense power, as I mentioned before, is not something physical, but it's the previous moment of mind. So actually it's the same as the immediately preceding condition. The uncommon empowering condition and the immediately preceding condition are really the same. And the object condition says various, because mental perception can so each of the 5 perceptions can only perceive its own kind of object. Visual can only perceive colors and shapes, not sounds or smells, right? Ear consciousness can only hear sounds, but not colors and shapes or tastes. Okay, so the 5 are restricted to their own specific kind of object. But the mental perception can experience anything. So mental perception is not conception. Okay, this is perception. So it's said that when we look at an object, let's say the Buddha image, it's more interesting than the thermos. So we're looking at the Buddha image, and usually our mind switches quickly into conception, thinking. You know, we look at an object and very quickly, almost immediately, we start thinking about it, right? What a nice statue. We think about the Buddha's qualities and so on and so on. So our mind quickly switches into conception, thinking. But it said that in between the visual perception of seeing the Buddha image and the conception, thinking about it, there's one brief moment of a mental direct perception, a mental perception. And it's just one moment. It's so brief that ordinary beings aren't able to notice it. So it's just happens like subliminal, we might say. But it is a mental perception, and then from there it goes into conception. Does that make sense? So in between every sense perception that we have of any of these 5 types, and then conception, thinking about it, there's always a moment of a mental direct perception. So that means it could experience visual objects, it could experience sounds, it can experience smells, tastes, tangibles, and so on. So that's one type of mental direct perception. So that is mental consciousness, and it does have an object condition. Conception doesn't have an object condition. And that's explained later in the book. But we don't have to go into that right now. There's also another kind of mental perception, which is sometimes it's called clairvoyance. In this book it's called clairvoyance. Venerable uses the term super knowledge. You heard about the super knowledges? Things like reading other people's minds, remembering past lives. So there's 5 or 6 different kinds of these super knowledges. So those are mental direct perceptions. So if you had that ability, if I could look at Venerable Pende and know what she's thinking, I can't, so don't worry. But if I did have that ability to see her thoughts, her mind, that is a mental direct perception. Okay, it's not visual. It's not. It's nothing to do with our 5 senses. It's not conception because it's not thinking. It's a direct perception with the mind, with the mental consciousness. So, I mean, most people don't have that ability, but they say that when you develop calm abiding, shamatha, and then go further and develop the various jhanas, then you can develop those super knowledges. But they also say some people have them from birth. Yeah, there's stories of that, like even little kids have these abilities to see things that other people can't see. And it's probably because they had that ability in a previous life and it's just carried over. Actually, they say we've all developed those abilities in past lives. We've all had these clairvoyances or super knowledges, but we've lost them. So nothing really special about them because you can have that and still be very deluded. But they are useful. I mean, for Bodhisattvas especially, they do want to develop these abilities because it helps them in their work for others. It's helpful to know what people are thinking, how to help them in the best possible way.
Why do we need that one moment of mental direct perception to mediate between going from direct perception with the sense consciousness into conception?
Did you say why? I don't think there's a reason. I think it's just that's how it is. Yeah. Why it's only one moment? I don't know. Maybe it has something to do with the transition from a direct perception to a conception. Maybe it needs that one moment of mental direct perception. I don't know. I haven't come across an expert.
I think it's pretty said that it induces the conception.
Yeah.
That moment induces the conception.
Mm-hmm.
Because it struck me. I remembered it because I was like, oh, that's interesting.
Mm. Yeah, could be. I haven't really heard or read an explanation as to why. We just say, this is how it is. So if you're not too tired, we do the next little bit of conception. I know you've been busy today, lots of things going on. So I just thought if we could finish conception, then we can, well, maybe we can't finish it. But anyway, let's look at conception. So conception, or also could also be called thought, is a state of mind that does not experience its object directly. Instead, it experiences its object via a meaning generality. That you know that term, right? That's in Purdue's book. It's a mental image of the object. And that's the appearing object of a conception. That's the object that actually appears to thought or conception. And the conceptual mind is not able to distinguish between the actual or engaged object that one is thinking about, for example, one's mother, and the mental image of the object. So you might think, wait a minute, is that really true? I can know, like, my mother's passed away already, and if I'm thinking about my mother, I know that that image is not my mother because she's not alive anymore. So I think we can know that with another mind, but the mind itself that is thinking about mother isn't able to know that. That's how I understand it. And one way we can see that is when we think of an object, we can at least sometimes get emotional about it, as if it's really there. I mean, this happens all the time when you're meditating, right? And you start thinking about something from the past and you can get all emotional about it, as if it's still there, as if it's still reality, right? We can get angry, we can get sad, we can get happy by thinking of things. And I think that shows that when we think of an object, that mind thinking of the object relates to that object as if it's the real thing. Yeah? Does that make sense? It's not the real thing. It's just a mental image. But the mind, the conceptual mind, isn't able to recognize that. And so that's why they say conceptions are always mistaken. Now this term mistaken, I put the Tibetan there because I think in Geshe Rabten's book, the translator uses a different term for it. So mistaken doesn't mean completely wrong, just not totally wrong. It's just mistaken in that one way. When we think about an object, that mind isn't able to distinguish the mental image that appears from the actual object. And it's just not possible, apparently, for a conception to be able to recognize that. So it always sees the object as if it's the real thing. So this is what they say. Conceptions have that error. But there are different kinds of objects. And if you look down, there's this little chart. And I think this was already in Perdue's book, so you probably came across it. There's one type of object called the engaged object, and another is the appearing object. There's even more objects than this, but this is keeping it simple. So the meaning of the engaged object is the actual object that you're looking at or thinking about, engaging with. And so here it says, in the case of an eye consciousness, when we have just a perception, eye consciousness perceiving blue, the engaged object is blue and the appearing object is blue. So for perceptions, like eye consciousnesses, the engaged object, the appearing object are the same thing. What you look at, what you're engaged with, what appears to your mind is the same thing. But in the conception, like it says here, conceptual consciousness thinking about blue, the engaged object is blue, so that's the object you're actually engaging with, but the appearing object is just a mental image of blue, a meaning generality of blue, not actually blue. And the same with our mother, or Dalai Lama. So when we think about the Dalai Lama, the engaged object is the Dalai Lama, but when we're thinking about the Dalai Lama, what is actually appearing to our mind is just this mental image, this meaning generality. And our mind is not able to distinguish those two things.
What is the engaged object and appearing object of bodhicitta? When you're thinking about bodhicitta.
Offhand, I would say that they say bodhicitta has two objects, actually. One is enlightenment, that is the goal that one wants to attain, and then sentient beings are the object that one wants to benefit. I'd have to check that. I'm not sure about that, so let me check that up and get if I can find an answer. I'll bring it back next time. Yeah, not sure about that. It's a little more complicated than thinking about blue or a cat or the Dalai Lama. And then it says, below that chart, it says, the engaged object of a conception can be anything, any phenomena, impermanent or permanent. We can think about anything, and even non-existent things, right? We can think about rabbit's horns and unicorns and Harry Potter and, all these things that don't even exist, but we can think about them. Okay, so anything can be the engaged object of a conception, but the appearing object is always this meaning generality, and that's said to be a permanent phenomena. You heard that before, right? Meaning generalities are permanent. Apparently there's discussion about that, if that's really the case, but this is what the tradition says, it's permanent. And conceptions are always mental consciousnesses, not sense consciousnesses. So maybe we stop there. That's probably enough for tonight. I was hoping to get further, but anyway, we'll get through this. So next week we'll get through that section, and then I want to introduce prime and non-prime cognizers, or what Venerable calls reliable and non-reliable cognizers, and then we'll get into the 7 types of awareness. So I thought it would be helpful to go through some of these other things before we jump right into the 7 types of awareness, because that's a bit more intense.
So why is the, for a mental conception, for concept, why is the mental image not considered the object condition, even though it's considered the appearing object?
Well, for one thing, an object condition has to precede the mind. So cause and effect, okay? Causes come first, the effect comes afterwards. So those three conditions of a perception occur prior to the conception. They give rise to the perception, okay? So those three conditions come first, and then the mind comes afterwards. Whereas in the case of the conception, the appearing object is simultaneous, so it cannot be a condition. And I can read in here what the reason why related to M's question, a conception doesn't have a what do you call it? Object condition. If I can find it again. Yeah. So page 67, if you want to look it up. So for a thought consciousness conception, there's no way to posit an observed object condition, because what appears to a thought consciousness is a meaning generality, this is your question, which, being permanent, cannot be a cause of anything. So that's another reason. Meaning generalities are permanent. Permanent things cannot bring results. They cannot be cause for anything else. And it says, moreover, a thought consciousness is produced through the force not of an external object, but of the consciousness which induces it, a prior moment of mind. So the main thing giving rise to a thought consciousness is the previous moment of mind, rather than an object casting its image to it. So observed object conditions are posited only for sense direct perceivers and the mental direct perceivers that they induce, not for thoughts.
So this actually comes from the beginning of your teaching. If there is always a subject and object, does this dissolve with direct perception of emptiness?
Well, what they say is when we have a direct perception of emptiness, it seems like the subject, the mind, dissolves into emptiness, and there's no sense of duality between subject and object. But the reality is there is still subject and object. There has to be. There's a mind, an awareness, and there's the object emptiness. But the sense of separation and duality, that dissolves. That's a good question. I don't normally talk about that, but I was thinking about that once, because they say the direct perception of emptiness is the most correct mind that there is. But then I thought, but wait a minute, there seems to be an error there. That there is actually a subject over here and an object over here, but it seems like they're not. But anyway, there's an answer to that, but I can't remember what it is. It's in Meditation on Emptiness. But relative to ordinary beings' minds and what they experience, the direct realization of emptiness is much more correct. But then finally, when you get to Buddhahood, you have the mind of a Buddha, then you're able to perceive everything simultaneously. You can perceive emptiness, and you can still perceive all conventional phenomena. So everything is appearing at once. You no longer have that sense of only emptiness appearing and no conventional. So there's a little bit of an error there, but maybe I don't think they like to call it an error. But it is something that needs to be gone beyond, something that needs to transcend.